Morena and kia ora, Izzy. Thank you so much for joining me. Really excited to have you and have a conversation about some of the work that you're doing. Potentially, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, kia ora, tēnā koe. My name's Isabella Lenihan-Ikin. I'm the National President of the New Zealand Union of Students Association. I'm originally from Auckland and then year at University in Dunedin, then dropped in and out of tertiary education and then finished my study at Victoria University of Wellington. And now I've taken a year off to be in this role, which is an enormous privilege. To be working on behalf of students across Aotearoa, both within polytech sector and also universities.
Kia ora. Well, it's great that you've been, placed across the country so you'd have some great understanding in terms of the education system, perhaps even just the communities, the diverse communities that you're working with. It'd be really great to, have a kōrero throughout this conversation around the education sector and the issues that we're seeing in the tertiary sector. But first, perhaps, what is the student union? What do you do? What is the association? And what types of cool things that you do to support young people?
Cool. So NZUSA, as we are commonly known, is the national representative body for tertiary students in New Zealand. And we're in our 91st year of operation. So we're a really old organisation. And we were founded on the values that tertiary education should be something that every person in Aotearoa, New Zealand should have access to. Obviously, the situation back in 1929 when we were started was very different. We had universities, although it was free, it was reserved for the wealthy elite. And now we have a tertiary education system which underwent huge transformation in the 1980s and early 1990s that is incredibly expensive for people, although has kind of more people across a kind of diverse group of the population who are able to access it, and is obviously just wider than universities, includes polytechs, PTEs, wānanga, ITOs, all the sector fall within the tertiary sector. What NZUSA has been working on, especially since 1990, when we saw tertiary education become something that went from a public good that we could access free of charge to something that is now like a service level transaction kind of arrangement where students have to pay in order to access higher education. We've been working to ensure that we break down these barriers that prevent people from being able to access tertiary education. That includes the cost, but it also includes the structural issues around the way that the tertiary education system is kind of created and founded upon. It also includes all the other aspects of student life, so from housing and tenancy to mental health to physical health to people who are parents or grandparents when they study, all those factors. Like, students are one of the most diverse groups of people. Obviously, often we can be homogenized down to kind of the 18 to 23-year-old moved away from home, but that is not the reality of being a student in Aotearoa. In terms of how we are structured as an organisation, we're a member-led organisation that's based on our members are students' associations within local campuses, both within polytechs and universities, and we're a completely student-led movement. Our partner organisation is Te Mana Akonga, the National Māori Students Association, and also Tauira Pacifica, the National Pacifica Students Association, which was founded in 2019. And we work really closely both within government to ensure that there's kind of short-term changes, but also work externally to ensure that there's a transformative shift in the way that our tertiary education is run and structured and paid for, so that it becomes a public good that is accessible to everyone.
Can I ask, what made you want to get into the space? Like, why? You could have gone in, many different avenues. Why this space?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family of, my parents, neither of them went to university, and but were very supportive of my older brother and I going into higher education. And I guess, and then I look at some of from a family perspective, the fact that, although tertiary education is something that has had the barriers kind of broken down, is still very inaccessible to lots of people, including members of my family. And I think that the key reason why I went into this kind of role and into kind of student representation generally was from that kind of foundation that it is so inaccessible to so many people at this moment. And also from my own personal kind of perspective, I have had, as I said earlier, I've dropped in and out of tertiary education, and that's because of the pressure in which our tertiary education system places on young people, and the mental health pressures, and the fact that, you know, being a student in 2020 or you know, kind of in the current state is really friggin' hard. And so we actually need to support current students in order to remain in study and so that they can achieve their dreams. And I think it's really important that we take that kind of holistic approach to tertiary education, and we recognise that it's not just the study pressures that influence people's day-to-day lives, it's all the other pressures. It's the fact that we're living in mouldy flats, it's the fact that we don't have access to proper mental health services. And from my perspective, if all those kind of barriers around access to health services or access to kind of warm, dry flats was available to students, then that would make our lives as students and as people who are required to submit assignments and go to lectures and go to tutorials so much easier. And it would actually mean that we can complete our studies and put all of our effort and energy into studies.
Yeah, I think there's so much, you know, richness in just the kōrero that you shared with us today. I would like to kind of just highlight, you know, this whole business aspect of the institutions and the way in which they're operating, because I'm seeing that kind of impact, and you know, through students and their stories, they are able to kind of see that, and that's kind of problematic if that's at a quite, you know, macro scale, but the impact that is having on a micro scale. Again, around the housing issues that we face as young people. So some of the work that I do is specifically within the housing space, and it's really hard to push, even just to ensure that young people are heard in these spaces and their needs are like even addressed or like people are aware of, which is quite problematic. So I was really curious in terms of the kind of COVID-19, you know, it's a whole nother level in terms of these are the issues even prior to the lockdown. How has this added pressure impacted the young people that you're working with today?
Yeah, and totally, like, really want to acknowledge that the issues that have come to light as a result of COVID-19 have been here for decades. And ever since that, we put a cost on education and we locked people out of accessing housing, and we like privatized and we moved people away from being able to access mental health support. That's when we've got these kind of really deep inequities showing their light in terms of this crisis period. And I think that Secretary of Education put it, Iona Holstead put it really well, in that COVID-19 doesn't create the inequities, it exposes them. And so in terms of the kind of key issues that we are seeing as a result of COVID-19, issues around financial insecurity and around mental health. And in terms of financial insecurity, I mean, students for decades have been saying that the cost of living is incredibly high, and the amount that students are required or are able to receive from the government each week is completely insufficient to cover weekly costs. And that essentially means that students are required, in addition to full-time study or part-time study, to take on full-time or part-time jobs in order just to cover their essential weekly expenses. And often, because students are required to juggle kind of that demanding workload of being a student, and also have other very, you know, significant things going on in their lives, whether it be children or supporting their family or kind of other commitments that they do week to week, they're required to have that flexibility in their kind of work. So lots work multiple part-time jobs, work in the gig economy, and so largely those are the sector where we've seen the work dried up. So here we have students who are expected to work and overwork in order to actually just cover their rent, now not being able to access any government support because the work that they did have was insecure, and therefore they're unable to access the wage subsidy. And so now we're seeing the government kind of finally realise that the support systems that they had in place were not only insufficient at the best of times, but they're insufficient in times of crisis. And what that is having, although it's having these acute impacts on people's financial security in terms of their ability to pay rent or power or week-to-week expenses or support their children. I had one student ring me up and she said, I actually have to decide now whether I pay for food to put on the table for my child or to keep her warm. No parent should ever have to face that dilemma. And that's on the fact that she is a nursing student and will be on the front line in several years. And if a crisis like this happens, she will be the one that makes that personal sacrifice to keep all New Zealand as well. And it's totally unfair that she has to make that kind of decision at the moment during this particular crisis. So the kind of flow-on effect of financial insecurity is that it's putting people, like, exacerbating the pressure on people's mental health. And I'm sure I don't have to kind of articulate the poor mental health among young people that we already see. We're one of the most vulnerable groups of the population in terms of anxiety and depression. And now we're seeing that kind of acute pressure being placed on people's mental health at a time when we're isolated from our friends and our family, and we're having to make these choices about food, about power, about shelter, and that's utterly disgraceful.
Yeah, and and it's really disheartening even just to hear it again. I've heard the same stories from everyone I've interviewed and, students that I work with, and it is simple things like just trying to survive at this time. And I'm not sure whether everyone understands the kind of layers, your responsibilities in the house, you're having no workspace, it's just a privilege. I had another colleague tell us yesterday that one of their students were having to work on the front porch of their house with a blanket in the cold because there was just no space. And it's just those types of things that sometimes people aren't aware of. But because I was going to actually ask you about, the potential support, but perhaps more so, what were your thoughts on the domestic tertiary package that came out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it can be classed as a support package. I think that at a time when we have over $16 billion of cumulative debt in this country, at a time when we're in this financial crisis where people are losing their jobs, the last thing the government should be doing is requiring and expecting students to get further into or to increase their loan even more. From a kind of point of fairness, I think that the government has supported other people through wage subsidy or mortgage freezes or mortgage holidays, and yet students are expected to borrow. Students are already expected to borrow to live, and they're one of the only communities in New Zealand that have that expectation. And I think that it just shows the government is completely unaware of the complexities and costs that students face week to week, given that they, made students take on another $1,000. I think that if you think about the policy and that $1,000, it actually fails to address the needs that students have been just kind of communicating to the media. And we've been working with the ministry week to week, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Development, and we have got this kind of preliminary survey out that enables us to kind of understand where the hardship is within the student community. The two biggest areas of hardship are financial and mental health. And if you break down the financial hardship, it's about paying bills, so like power, Wi-Fi, and paying for food and for paying for rent. So the way that they've structured this government support is through course-related costs, and the website, whether you just apply for course-related costs, directly says you're unable to pay for food and pay for rent. And they're the two biggest areas of hardship. So therefore you have this money that is failing to go into where the kind of hardship is coming from. The other thing is that it's only available to full-time students. Part-time students have been left out of this complete kind of support package. And they're the people that actually need the support the most, because often their parents or their grandparents or they're retraining or they've lost their job. And so they require government support at this time because they've got dependents to support, or they may have lost their other means of weekly income. And they're also unable to receive those weekly study link payments because they're a part-time student. So it fails to meet the areas of hardship where students are feeling it the most. And also fails to address the communities of students where there is that most kind of acute hardship.
There are so many things that I want to, kind of dive deep into, because there's so
Mm.
much in there that just people don't understand. And actually, I hadn't looked at the level of detail under the course-related costs. For me, you know, I already see that the whole debt, you know, will continue to marginalise us as a generation. It's my biggest problem, you know, especially in housing, debt, and so it's interesting in terms of this. It's quite defining for us, you know, as young people, and what that means in the future. So that is really problematic. Again, around, you know, so how we're supposed to retain our students and look after them. It's quite frustrating, because there's all these other factors that are contributing to the acute stress that you're saying. Like, it's really hard to be able to just fathom what are we supposed to do if we don't have government support. We've got lack of resources within the education system to support our students right now. But I was really heartened by your, you know, collaborative process to develop a action plan around what that looks like, you know, which was centered on equity. Could you talk about more, perhaps, you know, recommendations around how we might move forward, and some of the discussions that perhaps you've already had with the Ministry of Education?
Yeah, so in actually it was before lockdown, on the Friday before, so about 6 days before lockdown, students associations came together and we said, we need to front foot a plan, because otherwise there's going to be decisions made that exclude us, and they're not going to hear the kind of hardship that we face day to day. And so we came together as 44 students associations, and we recognised that what students require in order to get through, and we laid it out based on what the tertiary providers can support us with, and what the government can support us with, both in kind of financial and non-financial ways. And what was or kind of the values underpinning that, and you referred to one of equity. I mean, I think that, you know, it's so vital at this time when we have a crisis that we recognise that not everyone is experiencing the crisis in the same way. There are people across Aotearoa who are feeling the impacts of this particular pandemic far more deeply, and the impact will be far more long lasting than other members of our population. And that's purely because of the inequality and the current kind of structures that peg, you know, people as rich and people as poor, and the kind of everlasting structures where people are in this trap around poverty. That means that we simply have to do more to support the people where the impact will be deepest and most long lasting. And for many students, that's simple, right? That's just meaning that there are people who don't have access to devices, and therefore we need to provide them with devices. There are people that don't have access to internet, and we need to provide them with access to the internet. There are people who live in houses where they've got 12 to 15 people. They're unable to have a desk space or a study space, and therefore we need to provide the services that enable them to be supported. I think that what this action plan on COVID-19 kind of manifested in the way that it came together, as students associations kind of taking that control of saying this is what we need, is that students understand that it is far better if we work together across our community, and we realise that we as students are better if all of our cohort get through this, or all of our cohort graduate. And that may mean that some people get more money, or some people get more support. But as, you know, given that certain people have that privilege to be able to kind of break down and give that to other people, I think that's vital for us all getting through. We cannot have it that some people get through this fine and some people don't get through this well at all. We need to pull our support and resources together to ensure that people get through this and everyone gets through this okay.
Yeah, I agree. And even again, just coming back to the stories that I've heard from students and those who have just started, you know, first year. Imagine coming into university your first year, and this is the experience that you're kind of having through this pandemic. But then those around this, you know, more socio-economic privilege are struggling as well, especially our Māori and Pacifica who postgraduate study are struggling. So, but along the way, we have heard similar stories where, people only have their phones to access. They don't have computers. And then the support that is provided does not, you know, meet their needs in terms of the discipline that they're kind of working in. So,
Mm-hmm.
so complex in all this process.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it'll take us to kind of recover, I don't know when this is going to end. I don't know if you know either, but, what are some of those steps forward now, and where to from here?
Well, I think that, every day seems like something new happens, or, we're kind of at the whim of government in terms of the announcements and everything that's happening. And I think that that during this period of immense uncertainty, I hope that decision makers have been able to reflect on the fact that the status quo is not working for our planet, and it is not working for our people. And in kind of undertaking that point of reflection, I hope they realise that they need to actually address the structural inequities within our current system. And if that's in this kind of space that we work within in the education system, I think that looks like ensuring that tertiary education and higher education, whether that be in the polytech sector or universities or kind of other training institutes, is accessible to everyone. I think Jacinda herself has said that tertiary education is what will get people through this period of uncertainty. And she's also said that when people are educated and when they're trained, it benefits everyone. And I really, I appreciate these sentiments that are being shared by Jacinda. But I just want to note that I think it's really important that we don't just frame it in terms of the economic benefit of study. That study is about enriching our social, our cultural, our political lives. It's so empowering. And it's not just for the benefit that we can the kind of economic benefit that we might bring to the country. Our education and higher education has the ability to change lives in so many ways beyond the economic benefits. But I think that Jacinda, in making these comments, realises that education is a public good, and it is not something that should have this service and transactional component. It should be accessible and available to everyone. But in order for it to become a public good, it actually needs to be free in terms of the cost of study and reducing that $16 billion of debt. And it also needs to become accessible in terms of week-to-week expenses. It is totally unacceptable that people have to borrow $239.76 a week and work 20 to 40 hours on top of that in order to finance their weekly expenses just to get through this period of time. It's totally unfair that students have to endure this period of transient poverty in order to apparently get through and land an amazing job at the end. Because this period of transient poverty is not safe or right for anyone, and it's also a barrier for people being able to access tertiary education, and it prevents people from being able to realise their dreams. So we know that debt and the cost of living has pervasive influences on the mental health and the academic performance of current students. It is a burden to graduates in terms of continuing to see that 12% of their pay deducted to go back into their student loan, and that's if they're in New Zealand. If they're international, then they have to even pay more on that, and they have to pay interest on that. And it acts as a barrier for prospective students coming into tertiary education because they see it as more beneficial in the short term to go and get a job or to do some other form of kind of work or employment, simply because the cost of being a student is far too high. And if we're actually going to see that education will transform this economy, then we need to see the government come in with appropriate support packages that enable students to live in dignified ways through their study. They shouldn't have to endure this period of poverty and hardship and live in mouldy flats and have poor mental health just to get through and land this amazing job.
Yeah, I really felt that on a personal level, mental health, poverty and education and housing, and just all these factors that contribute to the well-being of our communities. But as I always thought about education being a pathway out of poverty for me. That's why, I came into this space. And I'm still in the education sector because I wanted to be able to give back to those, other people who would have been going through the same challenges as a young person.
Totally.
But today, just looking at my student loan, it's like, oh gosh, how long is this going to take? When are we going to be able to get rid of that debt so then we can start thinking about other things like, aspirations for housing or homes, whatever that might look like, and that reality is, you know, moving further and further. And then the added pressures of having to continue to deliver at a good quality, just putting a lot of, you know, pressure on my own kind of mental health. So really trying to figure out how to deal with it, even just as an individual. So I totally get, you know, and felt everything that you said right now is still very relevant. And I'm not even a student anymore. I'm just trying to ensure that we protect, you know, our students as well as having to do, all these extra responsibilities to support our own whānau. So it's always multifaceted, and I just really appreciate everything that you've said. Did you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share?
No, I think, but I actually just want to thank yourself and other members of the staff, because I think that often the tertiary system can, or we can think about the leaders in terms of like the vice chancellors or the chief executives of the tertiary sector as leading this charge. But actually at this time, students are so thankful of their staff and their lecturers and their tutorials, their tutors who run their tutorials, because at the same time that they're trying to balance their family pressures, they are coming to class over Zoom or over Facebook or whatever means it might be, and continuing to teach them in one of the kind of most unprecedented times that we will ever experience. And so often I don't think staff on the front line get the kind of acknowledgement that they invest into supporting students. And I know that yourself and many other staff at all tertiary providers across the country are sacrificing so much just to ensure that their students, their tauira, are able to get through. And so, yeah, massive thank you to you and your colleagues.
Kia ora, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's really great just to know that sometimes, you know, even myself, just a small person doing this little bit, but, you know, when there's a multitude of us trying to make change and sometimes dismantle the systems that don't seek to serve the people that we're working for, you know, it's just really heartening to know that. So I really appreciate the work that you and your whānau and your team are doing at this time to look after tūmanaki, to awhi our students like the way that we're supposed to. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to share this kōrero with everyone else. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. Thanks, Jackie.